We've had an amazing year in the series that we call Brew With Us. We've met some fantastic brewers, we've worked with some awesome breweries, and we've imparted such rich information for our homebrew viewers. We thought we would end the year on an absolute high. So where are we, James?
We're in Southwold, Rob, the home of Adnams.
And we're doing Ghost Ship.
We're in the beautiful seaside town of Southwold on the Suffolk coastline, and we've come here to spend some time with Adnams to really learn about the recipe for Ghost Ship, what goes into it, and how we might be able to produce it at home. Right, Rob?
Yeah, we're going to give it a crack. We're going to do a complete tour of the brewery. We're going to show you everything that goes into the wonderful beer that Adnams are producing here at their Southwold brewery.
And also, Rob, we're going to spend some time with Fergus Fitzgerald, who's their head of production here at Adnams.
So, Fergus, great to meet you. Thanks very much for inviting us here to the home of Adnams.
I think you invited yourselves.
Of course we did.
Yeah.
Can you, let's just start off with just a really brief history of brewing here at Southwold.
Yeah, so we've got records of brewing in Southwold going back to 1345, when Joanna de Corbie was brought up in court about the assize of ale, basically making beer too weak. So that's a really illustrious history of brewing. But then in sort of 1659, we know that the brewery that was at the back of the Swan Hotel burnt down, and they relocated that brewery to the site of the Adnams brewery now, the Sole Bay Brewery. So that passed through a series of hands until 1872, when George and Ernest Adnams moved here and bought the brewery. And so it's been Adnams Brewery ever since.
Fergus, can you tell us about your involvement with the development of Ghost Ship?
Yeah, so Ghost Ship, we did, I think 12 years ago was when we first brought it out, really. There was a visit over at the Anchor, which is a pub in Walberswick, just the other side of the estuary from Southwold. Yeah. And it was a group of hop merchants, and Garrett Oliver was over as well from Brooklyn. So they were over to see Mark Dorber, and they have a sort of relationship. So Mark invited us over, and they were talking about this amazing new hop called Citra, which had just really come out. Yeah. And we thought we must get hold of some. So we did. We managed to get hold of a little sample to try. And we thought, actually, we need to use this. And we sort of forget now, but Citra was so different from what everything else was like at the time. Yeah. So we thought next beer we were going to do, we had to use Citra in it. And then the sort of about 6 months afterwards, we decided we needed to do a Halloween beer, because we didn't do anything around that period of time. And we'd seen this bottle in one of the pubs around Southwold, so the Red Lion. They had this sort of shelf of sort of old Adnams beers, and in there was this beer called Deathly Pale Ale, which is a beer, and we sort of looked into it. It was a beer that was sort of done in 1975, that Adnams never released, but they designed this beer as a sort of strong ale, and it had a skull and crossbones on the front of it. It looked like the symbol for poison. So I think what happened in 1975 is they designed this beer, designed the name, and then someone at last minute thought, doesn't that look like the symbol of poison? And they went, yeah, it does. Let's not do that. So they renamed it Centenary Pale Ale, but it just sort of piqued our interest. So we decided we'd do a Halloween beer. Deathly Pale Ale was a great name, let's use that. But then the same sort of thing happened. We thought, actually, no, let's not do that. We won't call it that. Well, we designed the beer already. We designed it with Citra. We'd added a bit of rye in, because I've always liked the sort of nutty, sweet sort of toffiness you get from rye. Yeah, sure. So we thought that would work really well with the beer, and work with our yeast as well, and and the sort of flavours it makes. So we designed this beer, and we renamed it Ghost Ship rather than Deathly Pale Ale. Nice. Which probably was the best move, I think, probably in hindsight. And sort of went from strength to strength. We did it as a seasonal for 2 years. Sort of ran out before Halloween both years, which wasn't the most commercially popular sort of thing that happened, but then we managed to get hold of more Citra, and it's sort of just grown and grown ever since then.
So Fergus, you've brought us into the actual brew house here. So let's talk about the basis of Ghost Ship. Let's take a look at the malt bill. Can you tell us a bit about that?
So it's obviously mostly pale ale. So the pale ale we use comes usually from sort of two maltsters, sort of locally. We only use malt from sort of Suffolk and Norfolk. Partly because we're in the breadbasket of the UK, which is genuinely producing some of the best malting barrel you'll find anywhere in the world. Yeah. So we'd be crazy not to use it, and we try not to do that. Try not to be crazy where we don't have to be. Yeah. And obviously it saves in the travelling and all the miles as well. But really, the driver is it's really some of the best quality malting barley. Yeah. And then a bit of caramel adds a little bit of sweetness, a bit of balance to the bitterness. But then I guess the thing that we started using for Ghost Ship that they hadn't used for other beers previously was rye, and specifically crystal rye. And what we like about the crystal rye is it added a bit of nutty spiciness to the beer and a little bit of dryness as well. And we thought that would work really nicely with our yeast profile, and we'll probably talk a bit more about our yeast later on, but we thought that spiciness, the rye, would complement the yeast quite well.
So in the actual brewing process, did you notice that, or did using the rye create any issues for you?
It didn't, because by the time we started using it, we were already on this brew house.
Yeah.
So when I joined, we still had an old Victorian brewery that we'd only bought in the 1970s, but actually come secondhand from other breweries.
Yeah.
It was for a very typical English mash tun system, but we were sort of running it over capacity, sort of mashing in above the sparge arms, because we needed to get more out than we could actually get out.
Yeah.
So I think rye probably would have caused us problems then, and we didn't really use anything other than barley when we were using that system.
Right. Okay.
But when we put in the mash conversion lauter tun system, we knew we could start experimenting and using more grains. That, those grains that people know are going to cause them some problems.
Sure. Yeah. So you're now using the more continental way of brewing with the lauter tun.
Yeah, exactly. Where so the mash conversion system is really designed to convert the starch to sugar as optimally as possible, and the lauter tun system is designed to separate them out as optimally as possible. Whereas the usual mash tun system is a sort of a compromise between the both. So you never quite get the surface area you want to do the separation, because you're trying to do the conversion in the same tank as well.
Also, it makes the brewery so much more efficient because you can be reloading the mash tun whilst you're lautering.
Yeah, so we're in the middle of this lovely seaside town, which we chose to be in. We could have moved out like lots of other traditional breweries. We chose to stay here.
Yeah.
But that does mean we need to sort of work with our neighbours. We don't want to make noise at 1 o'clock in the morning.
Sure, yeah.
So we do try and move the brew through as quickly as possible during the day. So we sort of oversize the tanks so we can sort of mash in at sort of 5 o'clock, finish at sort of 9 p.m. sort of as the sort of latest. So we don't run 24 hours.
Maximising the hours that you've got.
Which means we do need to, so when we're converting in the mash tun, we'll have another beer in the lauter tun sort of running off, and we'll have a third beer in the kettle sort of boiling. So we can have 3 beers in the brew stream at any one time.
Awesome. So Fergus, we've looked at the malt side.
Yep.
Let's have a look at the hops that go into making Ghost Ship and how you use the hops on the hop side.
The whole reason for Ghost Ship was really around Citra. So Citra is still the dominant hop in it, but we do use a sort of blend of other American hops, and we use some English hops for bittering as well. The sort of change to the English hop, we had used American hops for bittering, but probably last year, maybe the year before, we decided we wanted to make sure we always had some English hops in everything we did, just to try and make sure we supported the English hop industry.
Yeah, sure.
Even in places where, like Ghost Ship, where the English hop can't really do much for the aroma side, but it can add to the bittering side. So we decided we'd do that. So we're stood by the hop dosing vessels. So
this is where things are different. So on a homebrew scale, on the hop side, we're used to homebrewers opening up the kettle, dropping the hops in, popping the lid back on or covering again. It's not the same situation here. So if you can talk us through that, that'd be great.
So when we put the new brew house in sort of 2007, we designed it so it would sort of take away some of the inconsistencies. So those things about the timing. So, if your mum calls, you've got to go and run away, and you forget to put the late hops in at 10 past, and you put them in 4 minutes later, whatever it is.
Yeah, we can't do that on a commercial
We don't want to do that
No,
because actually that gives small inconsistencies, but we're dealing with so much inconsistency in the barley, and it's already a lot of chaos.
Yeah.
So where we can get rid of some chaos, we do.
Sure.
So just purely on the timing. So we're stood by the hop dosing vessel. So we load in the hops in here before the start of the brew, and then the wort comes out of the kettle into whatever pot, and then takes the hops back in. So the bittering hops go in the first vessel, usually here, which go in at the start of the boil.
Yeah.
Usually the second vessel we're using for late kettle hops, and then the third one we're either using for late kettle or whirlpool hops. So they're all set on timers. So based on when the start of the boil is, it will take the hops in at whatever time we've told it, sort of preset it to.
So the wort's coming down into these vessels. It's dissolving the hop pellets that you're using in here into solution and then back into the kettle.
Exactly, yeah. So we're using mostly all type 90s sort of normally here.
Yeah.
We can bag things up and put them in and recirculate through, but that's sort of very rare. We sort of do that for special beers usually. So for type 90s, it comes in, wort hits it, and basically it explodes the hops, turns it into a slurry, and then takes it back in again.
So folks, we're here in your hop store here at Adnams. Can we dial into the hop bill for Ghost Ship, please?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we want to use some English hops in everything we do. So we use some Pilgrim at the moment for bittering in Ghost Ship, but it is really there just for bittering. We're not looking for anything else from it.
Sure.
So that goes at the start of the boil, and then we have some late kettle hops. So at the moment we're using some Chinook and some Cascade as late, and we we never used a lot of Chinook in the past, but I think what Dan, our head brewer, sort of brought to it, he started to manage to select Chinook, which has a lot more pineapple characteristic to it, which we're really, really loving. I think that pineapple note on Chinook is working quite well. And then the Cascade for the sort of classic sort of floral notes.
Is that UK Cascade you're using? Or?
It's US Cascade as well. We do use Cascade from the UK in some other beers.
Yeah.
And we do really like the characteristic on it, but it's not quite the same. And,
sure.
And we have bought Cascade in the past from Germany, and Cascade is different depending where you're getting it from.
Certainly is, yeah.
So you have to sort of dial it into what we're actually getting. But yeah, so at the moment we're getting that sort of nice floral note from the Cascade in the late, and then on the sort of Whirlpool hops we're putting in some Citra and a bit more Chinook then as well. And obviously the Citra is really the driver, and it's by far the biggest quantity in the whole recipe really. And the Citra, not just in the late, but then in the fermentation, dry hopping as well, is really driving most of the flavour, and then the other hops are sort of filling the gaps around the outside. And what we're looking for Citra, and the reason we fell in love with it in the early days, was that sort of classic lemon lime note you get from Citra, but also if you pick the right parts of it, you get a nice elderflower note, and that's the thing we're really looking for when we go and select Citra. We're looking to see which of those will give us this little elderflower note.
So dry hopping a beer.
Yep.
At what stage are you dry hopping?
So we're dry hopping just after we've skimmed the yeast. So our yeast is a top fermenting yeast. So we skim off the top after sort of 48 hours or so, depending on the sort of obviously speed of fermentation. So once the yeast is gone, then we're typically dry hopping. So it's still a bit warm, so we still get a bit of sort of fermentation, a bit of that sort of reaction with the yeast. We actually think that is probably key to developing some of that elderflower flavour. So as well as having the precursor for in Citra, we think actually having that conversion and that active yeast in there actually helps develop that. So just after yeast skimming, it always depends a bit on when we know we're going to, particularly for cask, when it's going into cask. Sure. We don't want it sat for too long, so there is always that balance between the time it's skimmed and when we know we're going to need it in cask. So we have to play around with that a little bit, but typically, well, not typically, always after it's skimmed.
Well, that goes with the brewery process as well, because obviously you're not going to be skimming yeast with hot products
no,
in
and
it as well, because you're going to need to be reusing the yeast.
That's the reason. So we need to reuse. So we'll see the fermentation in a bit, but our yeast room our fermentation room is essentially a yeast farm.
Yeah.
Basically, we're growing lots of yeast, and we have a byproduct which is beer, which people like, which is nice. But mainly, what we're trying to do is grow yeast and keep the yeast happy. So we do everything in our power to try and do that. And obviously, adding hops in and then trying to reuse that doesn't work well for the yeast. So yeast is a priority, and then the hops go in after that.
So approximately, how long are we looking at contact time for the beer?
So usually it's going in on sort of day 3, and for cask we'll usually put it into cask on day 7 or 8.
Okay.
So probably 3 or 4 days.
Yep.
So the first couple of days it's still relatively warm, but then we're sort of chilling down to sort of 6 degrees at the end.
Ideal.
And there's a lot of playing around now with. So when we first started doing it, I don't think we even mentioned the word hop creep sort of 12 years ago. Didn't sort of occur to anybody.
Sure, yeah.
But now we're obviously looking at that hop creep and seeing what's happening to the diacetyl levels.
So Fergus, at the heart of every beer is yeast.
Yep.
You've brought us to the yeast room.
Yep.
There's a lot of yeast in this room.
Well, yeah. So we have our own house yeast.
Yep.
So it's a house yeast. To give you a bit of history, we started using it in the 1920s. So it used to come from a brewery in Norwich called Morgan's Brewery. And so the Adnams brewers would go up, get some yeast, bring it back down and use it regularly. But then in the Second World War, Morgan's got bombed, so Adnams had to become self-sufficient in yeast. But luckily, obviously, yeast grows when it's in wort. Yep. So we skim that off, and then we bring it back to the yeast room where we hold it at sort of 4 degrees Celsius until it goes back into the next batch of beer. So we'll test how healthy the yeast, so we'll do the viability checks, how healthy the yeast is.
And you're doing all of that in-house, your labs here at Adnams?
Yeah, so because we're self-sufficient yeast, you have to know you're going to have enough yeast. So we need to know that we're putting in healthy yeast. We need to know we're going to get healthy yeast back out, because if we don't have a brewery anymore. We can't ferment.
Sure, yeah.
So that yeast is hugely important to us. It is a yeast that's very specific to us now. It's obviously, although it came from Morgan's, and we think it was probably a Whitbread B yeast originally. It's obviously morphed, it's changed, it's mutated over time for us. Yeah. So it is acclimatized to the Adnams brewery now, and it is a unique strain, or a mix of strains.
Yeah. So as homebrewers, we can't just go out and buy a strain of yeast that's going to replicate this. So that's one of the things that we're going to have to really work hard on.
Yeah, and it is. And when we talk of the strains, actually 2 different strains in there. So in the sort of 1970s, it was probably 5 or 6, and then they cleaned it up into the sort of two most dominant strains, and it's those two dominant strains that we still use today.
Yeah.
Individually, they're not good brewing yeasts, so they would not, individually, you would never use them by themselves. But when you put them together, they do a bit of co-flocculation. They work together quite well and give us the beer that we sort of know as Adnams.
Folks, we're here in the fermentation room.
Yes.
We've got a lot of tanks here. What sort of level of, how many tanks have we got in here?
So in this room, we've got 12 fermentation tanks, and there's another 7 in the room next door. These are all essentially open, they're not pressurized vessels, so they're essentially squares. They just happen to be rectangular squares.
Yeah. Yeah, okay, so they're not pressure vessels.
No.
You're not fermenting under pressure.
Not in here.
They're open vessels,
Yeah.
vent into atmosphere.
Exactly. We do have some conical vessels that we can ferment under pressure, but these ones are specifically designed around our yeast, and our yeast is a top fermenting yeast that doesn't like lots of pressure. So these went in about 2001 to 2004, and they were really designed around making our yeast happy. And that's true across a lot of the brewing process. What we're keen to do is make our yeast happy, because it can be cranky.
Okay, so this is really interesting. I know that we've touched a little bit on yeast a little earlier. However, this dual strain yeast that you're using, can you tell us a little bit more about that and how both strains work together?
Yeah, so one of the strains, which is the sort of dominant strain, it will ferment more the sort of spectrum of sugar, so it will make the beer much drier.
Yeah.
It also tends to make more sulfur, but the main downside with it is it doesn't drop out, it doesn't flocculate, sort of stays in suspension most of the time.
For cask, that's not great.
And that's not great for cask.
Yeah.
It's not great for anything if you're trying to skim the yeast off as well, because none of it comes up. Whereas the other strain doesn't ferment enough of the spectrum of sugars, and it drops out too early. So if we only use that strain, we'd end up with beer that was too sweet and wasn't fully fermented.
Right.
So by having the two in sort of unison and sort of roughly 50-50, they sort of pull each other out and they sort of control the fermentation to where we want it to be. So we do a lot of work about making sure the yeast stays in balance, because when it's in balance, it ferments very well, it flocculates very well, and when it goes out, it causes us lots of problems that we then have to spend a lot of time solving.
Yeah. The actual characteristics of the yeast itself. Now, I was actually amazed when I got some Ghost Ship. I knocked out as much of the CO2 out of it as I possibly could, and I also warmed it up slightly.
Yep.
And the esters and aromas that were coming off it, not hop driven, these were yeast driven,
Yep.
I was amazed by.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about how possibly a homebrewer could start to replicate what you're using here?
So I think one of the things we've probably only really learnt in the last maybe 10, or maybe described in the last maybe 10 years, is our yeast has quite a Belgian character together. So it's probably driven by one of the strains, but we think it's a sort of the class where it's really sort of quite Belgian-y.
Yeah.
It has a lot of spicy characteristics, and it will produce lots of fruit esters. So those sort of jammy, strawberry, pear drop. They will produce lots of those given the right temperature and the right fermentation profile.
Yeah.
So by having the two strains, it gives us the flexibility in terms of lots of flavors, but actually that Belgian spicy characteristic still sort of lingers no matter where.
I was amazed going through that process with Ghost Ship. I was actually really surprised at the esters and aromas that were coming off it. It was saison in aroma and quite.
Yeah, and I think I think that's the key for us. I think, and we like the fact we have a sort of sense of place. We like the idea that you can't really make this beer everywhere, so we don't try and make the same thing like everyone tries. We try to work with our yeast, we work with our water to try and make something that is uniquely us.
Yep.
And the yeast is really the driver for all of that. So I think if you're trying to replicate the flavors, you do need a bit more complexity on the yeast. You need to look outside maybe of just the sort of typical UK sort of strains that sort of you'd use for a pale ale. I think look a bit broader than that. Maybe a saison yeast, maybe something sort of more Belgian-y, but that sort of has that spicy characteristic going on. That's what really needs to look for.
What sort of temperature are you fermenting at?
So Ghost Ship, we're fermenting about 19. So we play with the temperature a bit depending on what we're trying to do. So if we want big fruity esters, so our bottle broadside, we'll ferment at about 22, 23 degrees, and the yeast will produce lots more of that sort of strawberry cherry note at that sort of temperature. If we want it to be less than 19, less of those fruit, we'll ferment about 19.
Yeah.
And if we want it to be really as clean as we can make it, given our yeast, we'll probably try and ferment about 17, 18.
Okay. So we're now sampling the delights of Ghost Ship in the Adnams tasting room.
Yep.
Just before we dive in, a really important factor in this beer is the water.
Yep.
what actually are we dealing with here? We know that the water's rock hard.
Yeah, that's true. And it's obviously typically for this region, it is hard water. So we're dealing with sort of raw water, alkalis are sort of up around the 400. And we used to have a well supply. So back in the 1920s, Adnams was using well supply water for brewing, but it got contaminated with salt water.
Oh, okay.
And I think the saltwater phase of beer wasn't quite ready yet. So they decided not to do that. So use town's water. So we bring it in, we put it through some big carbon filters to strip out the chlorine.
So this is interesting. So you're not running it through an RO plant?
No, we're not. Oral water on a commercial scale can be quite wasteful because you're sort of wasting about 30% of the water you're putting in.
Absolutely.
So we made a decision a long time ago we weren't going to do that, and we were going to sort of embrace the water that we use locally rather than try and make it into everything we possibly wanted it to make into.
Yeah.
Then we deal with the alkalinity by adding some sulfuric acid, which brings it down to sort of about 70. And then when we're mashing in, we'll add some calcium sulfate, and then we'll add a bit of magnesium chloride in the sort of kettle as well, just to deal with the sort of magnesium levels. But that's essentially our water treatment all the way through. It doesn't get more complicated than that.
It's actually really interesting because, as we know, a lot of breweries are using RO water and building water profiles back in. But actually, increasingly, we are coming across more breweries that are actually dealing with what they've actually got.
Yeah, I think it gives us again, along with the yeast, it gives us sort of something that sort of makes something what we're making unique, and it makes it sort of Adnams.
Yeah, it's
rather
beer, yeah.
We're not trying to make the same beer that everyone else is making. We're trying to make something that is ours.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think that adds to the sort of story of it as well.
Yeah. So one of the things that's making it special is your water.
Yeah, and we don't talk about water enough because it's bloody complicated when you're trying to work out the sort of the ratios and the dosings. But actually, it does drive a lot of the styles of beer around the world are driven by what your local water's like.
Yeah.
So we sort of take that view that we will deal with what we have and make the styles that work with our beer or work with our water. Sorry.
Right. So at this point, actually, we've got a couple of really important things to do.
Yep.
And the first one, and most importantly, is to say a massive thank you to Fergus and the team here at Adnams. We've been made to feel massively welcome by everyone, and the information that you've given us has been absolutely fantastic. So it's been a really, really interesting couple of days. So thank you very much for that.
More than welcome.
Secondly, we have now got to take the information that you've given us, and we've got to go back to Malt HQ, where we're going to have a crack at brewing Ghost Ship to the best we possibly can.
Yep.
After we've done that, we're going to send you a couple of bottles, and we're going to see exactly what you think.
No, I really look forward to it. And we've done it a little bit in the past where people have tried to make some recipes, and I think for one of the local homebrew association, Ghost Ship came, so they put actual Ghost Ship in the Ghost Ship clone competition, and it only came second.
Oh wow.
So,
interesting, yeah.
So we're really interested to see what it comes out like.
I can't wait to send you a couple of bottles. It's going to be awesome. Thank you
Cheers.
very much.
No, cheers. We'll do that. Cheers.
Cheers.
We've learnt a vast amount of what goes into making this glorious beer, the sense of place it has within the history of Adnams and Southwold. Taking everything learned, we've built a recipe that pays the closest possible homage to Ghost Ship. If you would like to be part of this story, then pick up a recipe kit to brew for yourself using the link below. Join us in part 2 of this series, where Jim and I head back to Malt HQ and brew our version of this distinct beer. Plus, we ask a panel of beer experts to judge our version of Ghost Ship. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, hit the bell for notifications, and hit like on the video. Have a great brew!